Afternoon, Chairman.
Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everybody. Welcome to today's virtual meeting of the Lincolnshire Schools Forum on the 19th of January, taking place at 1:30. My name is Gavin Booth and I am the chairman of this meeting. As usual, before we begin, there's some matters of procedure to discuss. So just to let you know, today's proceedings will be audio broadcasted and recorded. If you're invited to speak, can you please then obviously turn your microphone and camera on, but at all other times, if you can keep your mic muted and your camera off, that will just help the meeting move along smoothly. If at any point you want to join the debate, raise a question, then please just type chat or speak in the chat, please, for me, and we'll try and come to you as quickly as we can. If at any point you lose contact with the meeting, then hit the big red leave button and try and rejoin the meeting, and we'll let you in as soon as we possibly can. And if at any point I'm made aware that the live broadcast isn't working, we'll kind of pause the meeting for 5 minutes while that gets reconnected and join again. So thank you very much. We look forward to working with you today. Can I just ask Emily, please, to confirm the presence of everybody at the meeting and make us aware of any apologies. So back to you, Emily.
Yes, thank you. I'll just do a quick roll call if everyone could just confirm if they're present. I've got Amy Stancer.
Present. Happy New Year, everyone.
Thank you. Kyna Adkins. Tony Stevens.
Good afternoon.
Alan Howe.
Good afternoon from a sunny and chilly Sutton-on-Sea.
I think we've just got Kyna. There we go. Catherine Stratton.
Present. Please could I just double check that I'm okay to still be here if my camera's not working on my device? I won't be able to turn it on. Is that?
Yes, no, that's fine. As long as we can hear you, and you can just, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Callum Clay.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Rachel Barrett.
I am here.
Jo Slessor.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Professor Ken Durrans.
Present, Emily.
Thank you. Gavin Booth.
Yep, I'm here, thank you.
Katie Gravel.
Afternoon, everybody.
Simon Morley. Simon Morley. No, I forgot. Sorry, Stephen Borgwaniff.
Hello, I'm present.
Thank you. Josh Greaves.
Yeah, thank you.
Julia Merivale. Julia, sorry. And Heather Marks. Have I missed anybody that's present?
Hi, you've missed me, Lee Mason.
Oh, I'm very sorry. Thank you very much. There you are. You're at the bottom of the page. Thank you. And we also should have the following officers in attendance today: Mark Popplewell, Strategic Finance Lead, Children's Services; Elizabeth Bowes, Strategic Finance Manager, Schools Finance Team; Geraldine Wilders, Head of Service for School Strategy, Children's Education; Martin Smith, Assistant Director for Children's Education; Tony Warnock, Head of Financial Services; and Geraldine O'Neill, Sustainability and Development Manager. Is that all the officers we've got present as well? Thank you. I'll just move on to the apologies then. We've received apologies from Andy Watts, Mrs. Frances Green, Dr. Stephen Hopkins, Peter Tomlinson, Michelle Anderson and Simon Pickett. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Emily. We'll move on to then item 2, which is declarations of members' interest. If any members have interest they wish to declare, if you could type speak in the chat for me, that would be great. I can't see anything coming up, so I'll just give it 30 more seconds. Okay, Moving on then to item number 3, which is the minutes of the Lincolnshire Schools Forum held on the 6th of October, which is pages 7 to 14 of your pack. I'd like to propose these minutes as being a correct record. Do I have a seconder? If you could please enter that into the chat for me if you're happy to second.
Seconded, Chairman.
Thank you. So that's Ken Durrans and Josh. So either one of those to second, please. So it's therefore proposed and seconded that the minutes be approved. If you wish to abstain or vote against, can you please indicate that in the chat for us? But if there aren't anybody abstaining or against, and we're happy to accept those as a true record, then we will move on to item number 4, which is another brief one, which is Chairman's announcements. There are no announcements today, so we'll move swiftly on to item number 5, which I think is going to take the bulk of our time today. So this is the school funding arrangements for 23-24. It's on pages 15 to 34 of your pack, but you will also have received today some additional papers that I think Mark will refer to as part of this. So I'm going to hand over to Mark Popwell now to present this paper. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, what I'll do is I'll talk through both papers, but firstly we'll talk through the main item 5 paper. In summary, it's noting the contents of the report is to agree the local authorities' proposals relating to a number of centrally held budgets. And then the final one is supporting the local authorities' proposals relating to the measures to address affordability of the mainstream schools national funding formula, which the briefing paper specifically picks up. So by way as a background, in terms of the mainstream schools national funding formula, this was introduced in 2018-19, and its purpose was to create consistency in funding across all schools to ensure a fairer settlement for each school. Since its introduction, local authorities have continued to be responsible for agreeing and calculating school budgets. However, local authorities were encouraged to move to that national funding formula. Only 78 of the 150 local authorities have mirrored the national funding formula in 22-23. Lincolnshire is one of those. And as I say, we have replicated that since its introduction in 18-19, and that through this national funding formula, schools have had increased funding levels as a result. So the government's initial consultation outcomes on how further reforms to the national funding formula can be implemented for mainstream schools, with the intention to move into the hard formula, was published last year, and that was reported in the Schools Forum April 2022 meeting. And one of the things to focus on there was about the consultation was looking at progressively tightening up the rules regarding local authorities' flexibilities over schools funding, essentially the government's way to move schools closer to the national funding formula, with a view in a number of years' time for all schools to be on that national formula. So in July 2022, the government announced its funding intentions for 23-24, and a report was presented to the Schools Forum in October 2022, providing the details of that. So I won't repeat that level of detail. What the government did publish in December, late in December, just before we broke up, was the funding allocations from a local authority level across all of our 4 blocks of the dedicated schools grant. And as expected, there were minimal changes to the versions published in July 2022 in terms of their stated intentions. In terms of overall national funding for 23-24, school funding levels were set to rise by 1.5 billion to 55.3 billion, or a 1.9% increase in per pupil funding. And you'll have been cited on the autumn 22 autumn statement announcement of a further 2 billion increase in schools funding in each of the years 23-24 and 24-25 in response to the increasing costs that schools are facing, particularly relating to staff, pay and utilities. And essentially this separate new grant equates to a 3.4% increase in per pupil funding. And for Lincolnshire, a total grant that will receive of that £2 billion of the 18.9 million for the sector. So that's certainly welcomed in terms of that announcement to meet those additional cost pressures. a share of the 2 billion additional grant allocation, so 400 million of it was actually to be directed to the high needs block, of which Lincolnshire's high needs block will increase by a further £5 million as a result of that. And again, that is welcome news. So in terms of the overall dedicated schools grant, it remains a ring-fence grant that only can be used in accordance with the schools and early years finance regulations. Table 1 picks up the overall publication of Lincolnshire's dedicated schools grant across the 4 blocks of schools block, central school services block, early years block and high needs block. So overall, just short of 726 million. So moving on to the next page and picking up schools block specifically. So the schools block allocations are calculated by aggregating schools notional allocations under the national funding formula. And then it's then treated as a per pupil value for primary and secondary rate for each local authority. And that table, which you've seen before, and I think it was presented in the October Schools Forum, shows where Lincolnshire sits in the national level. So we're below the national average, but actually what we are seeing, particularly in the primary sector, that growing in terms of Lincolnshire's rank in terms of nationally. Secondary schools remains at the prior reported level as the prior year. Then move on to the central school services block. The LA is allocated funding to reflect the ongoing responsibilities for the local authority in education. And that is in 2 areas of ongoing responsibilities, where it's based on a formula factor. And then there's an element of historic commitments, whereby we had previous contracts in place. However, the government are phasing that out, sorry. And then in terms of the high needs block, so the basic structure of the high needs block for 23-24 is not changing. The bullet points below that detail the makeup of that. But essentially, the government is continuing to move to a basis of distributing funding to the LAs for children and young people on a pupil-led basis, taking into account more up-to-date assessments of the level of needs. Local authorities will be protected under the formula, and we'll see a minimum increase of 5% per head in 23-24 compared to the prior year. And the high needs block will be 126 million, and that's just over £11 million increase from the current year's funding level. And that does include those figures do include the additional £5 million announced from the autumn settlement. The SEND green paper acknowledges the unsustainable SEND system and considers ways to address this. We're waiting for the outcomes of that consultation to see what those next steps are, but clearly that is a key driver to ensure that overall funding within the high needs block remains sustainable from a national level also. And that was touched on in the October meeting in terms of the scale of the overspends that we're seeing across all local authorities, albeit Lincolnshire is in surplus, but prudent management is certainly important. Lincolnshire Special Schools formula is robust and is underpinned by key cost drivers, so that's within the high needs block, and the underlying principles and the formula will remain in place for 23-24, but the formula will respond to the inflation cost rises facing the sector, just like what we've seen in the mainstream schools. In terms of the early years block, the Schools Forum paper, which is the next agenda item, picking up the early years national funding formula, will set out those proposals, but it does summarise within the report the overall funding levels within the early years block. So moving on to other key announcements, so pupil premium, we're seeing the values increase by 5% in 23-24, and you can see the pupil premium different factors in that section. Universal infant free school meals, that rate has not been published as yet. If we move on to the mainstream schools additional grant, so this is the autumn 2022 announcement of the 2 billion funding nationally going to schools in 23 and 24. So that's a separate grant that will be outside the national funding formula for 23-24, just due to the lateness of the announcement. But the intentions are that will be mainstreamed into the national funding formula from 24-25, so building it into the actual overall formula. And you can see there the bullet points in that section whereby it details how that funding is to be distributed, and a communication has been sent out to all schools explaining that, along with a calculator via the DFE website that can provide indicatives of how much each school will receive. So the next section is the budget, DSG schools budgets relating to mainstreams. At this point, I'd like to talk through the additional shared paper. So if I could get everyone to open that or go to that report, if possible. Okay, so in terms of this separate briefing papers, it was touched on in the actual report itself. So clearly we're going through a process at the moment of using the October 2022 information and feeding it into the authority pro forma tool, which is a tool that the DFE provide, and to determine school budgets. So we're currently in the process of determining school budgets, which will then be published, will be shared with the Department for Education for verification, ensure we're in compliant with and compliance checks to ensure that we're meeting all the regulations. So at the moment we're going through that process, but this is a sort of an updated position as of this morning in terms of where we are on that process, and we're just going through our validation process at the moment. So in terms of the fundamental principles of the government's national funding formula, that's not changing for 23-24. The main reasons why that we have causes for the schools block affordability challenges, it relates to the government's application of lagged funding, whereby local authorities' pupil-led elements such as free school meals and other deprivation factors, they're based on prior census, so October 2021. But schools, so the local authority is required to fund schools, mainstream schools for 23-24 based on the latest census, which was the October 2022. So any change from those two censuses means that the schools block has to somehow manage that change. And essentially that's what we've faced over the last few years because of the growth in the free school meals as a result of the pandemic. In terms of, and essentially this is the implicating factor that's faced us for funding the 23-24 allocations. So for 23-24, the policy decision is to continue adopting the schools government's national funding formula, subject to affordability. The October 2022 schools census has continued to see a significant growth in both free school meals and free school meals over 6. And I think this year it's very much relating to the cost of living challenges, of which in the primary sector it's increased by just over 8%, and in the secondary sector just over by 14% from the prior year, at an overall cost of 2.3 million. Prior attainment factors have also had an additional cost, so an increase in need relating to prior attainment at just short of £1 million. So the additional costs have been partly offset by schools not requiring additional top-ups related to the minimum per pupil funding levels, so just short of 700,000 reduction relating to that funding stream. But essentially there's an affordability gap of 2.656 million to adopt the government's national funding formula in its entirety, including a 0.5% minimum funding guarantee. So essentially, the local authority is unable to set an affordable formula, and obviously with limited time to consult, the LA, based on prior consultations and decisions, will follow the same principles that we've adopted in prior years. So in this section, we've got 3 areas where we're proposing to address that affordability gap. So the first one is looking at the school growth funding budget. And essentially, this is a budget that is there to provide financial support to those schools going through reorganisations. So these are planned reorganisations whereby the local authority is required the school to expand permanently or temporary to meet our statutory duty of providing school places for pupils in Lincolnshire. So the funding that we receive is a formulaic arrangement looking at prior data growth, and that allocation is 3.437 million. We've gone through our commitments in terms of school growth arrangements based on our policies that we've got in place, and the requirement is only a £1.5 million budget. We're therefore proposing that the remaining sum of 1.934 can be moved to the to fund the national mainstream schools national funding formula. The schools growth fund is within the schools block, so there's no transfer of block, and this is an approach that we've adopted in prior years too. So the second proposal relates to a budget transfer to the schools block of 495,000 from available funding within the central school services block, relating to those historic commitments. So as we've referred to in the past, those historic commitments category of funding will continue to see reductions of 20% in line with the DfE's expectations that these are starting to reach their natural conclusion. The Central Schools broadband budget, which you'll be all aware of, reached its natural conclusion in October 2022. And essentially schools are meeting that cost going forward. So there is no requirement to hold a central budget anymore, and the regulations wouldn't allow us to continue paying it in that way. Because there's a difference between the way we're funded and the way that the actual contracts work, it means that we've got available funding in 23-24 and therefore propose a budget transfer to the schools block of 495,000. The local authority is to seek the support of the Schools Forum for this transfer to take place in line with the regulations. And then finally, the remaining shortfall of 227,000 is planned to be addressed through a downward adjustment of 0.075% of the key stage age-weighted pupil unit values from the government's national funding formula rates. And those can be those are reflected in Table 1 of the report. As you can see, those changes are relatively modest in the grand scheme of the overall schools funding arrangement, and it enables the local authority to replicate the formula, albeit the ORPU element, we're unable to meet that full rate. For the purposes of the DfE's tightening criteria to move all LAs to the hard formula, local values within the range of 2.5% of the respective national funding formula values are deemed to be mirroring the national funding formula, and therefore Lincolnshire falls into that category. And also what that means is that we can then set national formula rates in 23-24 anywhere between a plus or minus 2.5% range. So the local authority consider a sector-wide solution to be the preferred approach in relating to managing this affordability gap for the 2023. And the ORPU is proposed to, as I say, reduce by 0.075%, below that of the NFF value. The impact on the schools level is low, and across the sector it's on average to be 0.04%. Below the government's national funding formula on a overall school budget allocation. So we would consider that to be the fairest approach to manage that affordability gap. And that decision will be subject to approval by Councillor Bradwell. Further on in the report, it does explain about the key factors of the 23-24 arrangement. And essentially, the concluding factors is about that the policy decision to continue adopting the national funding formula is still in place, but obviously subject to affordability. We are unable to set an affordable formula, and therefore the steps and approaches that we've applied to address that gap. And in terms of the recommendations on this element, it is obviously to support the local authority's central school services block transfer to the schools block, and also to support the addressing of the affordability through the school growth fund and the downward adjustment of the age-weighted pupil units for all primary and secondary schools by the value of 0.7075%. So then I'll move back onto the main report, and I'll pick up the next section. So the next section refers to the dedicated schools grant central budgets, which require a decision by the Schools Forum today. So we continue as a local authority to set prudent approach to the management of the budgets, and there's reasons for that as well in terms of the local authority's limitations in terms of movement of funding across the blocks. A number of budgets are very demand-led, difficult to estimate and control, and many of those are actually encountering significant growth in demand as well. The government, as I touched on in the October meeting, the government has now assessed the statutory override position and will be continuing that on a one-off period for the next 3 years up to March 26. Essentially what that means is the local authorities are required to carry forward the whole of overspends to the school's budget in future years to address. Therefore, overspends need to be managed within the overall DSG rather than potentially from other council sources. So the budget setting process has been concluded, and although further refinement will be taking place, particularly at those areas where there's demand-led budgets, particularly in the high needs block. So the DfE regulations contain a number of provisions to the setting of central budgets, and in light of those regulations, tables 2 and 4 set out the budgets requiring Schools Forum approval. So the first one on table 2 relates to the school growth funding, as we've just talked about in the prior paper. So this budget requirement for 23-24 will be 1.503 million. And essentially that funds our statutory responsibility and our policies determining how much funding is allocated to those schools that the local authority have asked for to grow, whether that's temporary or a permanent expansion. Table 3 then picks up the other budgets requiring Schools Forum approval, which relate to the Central School Services block ongoing commitments. So we've got admissions, so that funds our statutory duty to operate the admissions arrangements in county schools. And the increase in costs relate to the pay award that has been sanctioned in the current year. We've then got a SACRE budget, which is expenditure relating to the LA's duties relating to the Standing Advisory Council on Religious Education, and that budget remains at the prior year level. We've then got the local authority retained duties for all schools. So this is a statutory responsibility for LAs that they hold for our schools, which relate to statutory and regulatory duties, education welfare, and asset management. And the funding that is held in this budget is the same level that was transferred into the dedicated schools grant by central government of 1.5 million. And this is periodically reviewed, but there is assessment that there's no change required for 23-24. There's a modest budget for the servicing of the Schools Forum at 20,000. And then finally, the Central School Services block also holds the centrally employed teachers' employer pension contributions. So this is relating to an additional budget that the department added in, which related to the increase for the teachers' pension scheme from 16.4 to 23.6 in September 2019. And this money then gets distributed out to meet those additional costs. And then finally, in terms of Table 4, the historic commitments. So now we've only got one historic commitment, which relates to the Private Finance Initiative PFI scheme, where back in around the early 2000s, it was we built through this scheme, PFI scheme, 7 schools, 3 primary and 4 special schools. And without this budget, the contract in place, and without this budget, would be unable to meet those ongoing historic commitments. And the contract comes to a conclusion in August of 2032. So this budget meets the affordability gap, and those are unavoidable costs for the 4 special schools under this PFI scheme. So as I've said, some minor refinements to the overall budget may be necessary in light of officers' ongoing work. And we'll be provide an update to the Schools Forum in the June meeting when we present the Section 251 budget statement, which shows the intentions of how we are intending to deploy the dedicated schools grant. Education Services Grant, general duties. This is the general duties relating to maintained schools relating to the local authority. And the LA continues to make a decision not to retain any funding to support these duties. This will be reviewed on an annual basis, but no deductions have taken place relating to this. And then finally, looking at the children's services and the council overall financial positions. This is outside the dedicated schools grant, but hopefully helpful for information purposes. Our executive is currently consulting on a single year budget for 23-24 for revenue and capital. The autumn statement did reflect a more positive outcome for 23-24 and 24-25 than was anticipated. However, the government have signalled that public spending will increase at a much slower rate after 24-25. So in terms of the council-wide position, it does reflect a deficit position in all years. The deficit estimate for 23-24 is circa around 10.3 million. And in closing that gap and balancing the budget, the council can either use available reserves or increase council tax. But the latter on its own would only partially address that. So at the moment, the budget is out to consultation. And two areas to note in terms of children's services specifically, due to the link. Our children in care is our main pressure area in terms of demand and cost. The council, so children's services have raised a cost pressure of 1.689, reflecting the growth in children in care. The increased composition of costs because of the composition in terms of requiring more external placements, and also the increase in special guardianship orders as a way of permanence. We also have a cost pressure of 1.4 million relating to social care legal costs due to the complexity of cases and increase in children in care. So then really just concluding the paper itself. So the authority pro forma tool for mainstream schools will be submitted to the ESFA by tomorrow for compliance check-in, and we'll be then working towards publishing school budgets by the end of February. So in summary, we're obviously requiring some decisions from the Schools Forum on this paper. Firstly, it's to note the contents of the report. But secondly, to agree those local authority proposed central budgets. And then finally, the supporting the local authorities' proposals relating to addressing the affordability matters of the mainstream schools national funding formula. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Can I invite any questions, please, for Mark on this? There was a lot in there and a lot going on. So if you just want to just type in the chat, let me know if you want to come in and ask any questions. That would be great. I'll just keep my eye on it. Can I ask a quick question, Mark, while we're waiting for people? Obviously, you're proposing that we're going to have a kind of on the ORPU front, we're going to kind of do a reduction at primary and secondary. Were there any other options open to you that kind of you considered in terms of other ways of kind of addressing the shortfall between what we could do locally and the national funding formula before we came up with that kind of deduction across those two areas?
Yeah, I guess there was a number of options. One was reducing the minimum funding guarantee. So that's prior year it was plus 0.5 to 2%, plus 2%. The department have changed that to 0 to plus 0.5%. We're honouring the existing decision, which was plus 0.5%. We could have reduced that to 0%, so those schools wouldn't receive any increase in funding, barring the new grant that's just been announced. But the savings or the savings for the affordability purposes would be marginal. So actually it wouldn't actually resolve it in full. And then the other one was the ceiling cap. So we could have put a ceiling cap. So for those schools that have seen an increase in their funding, we could have put a ceiling cap on there. But there's obviously disadvantages with that, because actually some of those increases could have been relating to an increase in free school meals, where there's potentially additional resources that schools would need to put in to support children. Therefore, we felt that would compromise their in terms of a response to that. So therefore, they're trying to follow that sort of a fair and objective approach. Is because of the modest sums, it's actually managing that from an overall level, and actually meaning that the impact on schools is relatively small as a result of that.
Great. So rather than impacting a few more heavily, it's kind of a shared, a shared approach, really. I'm not seeing anything else coming up in the chat, so we're going to work our way through these proposals and try and agree them line by line. So we've been asked to note the contents of the report, and assert that we've done that. The next thing that we're going to ask you as Schools Forum members is to agree the local authorities' proposals related to a number of centrally held budgets. Now, I'm going to suggest, rather than going round on these 4 or 5 recommendations individually asking people, if we could just have an indication whether you dissent, so if you disagree with that proposal, by indicating that in the chat, we will then kind of assume that everyone's happy if we don't see that pop up on the screen. So we're asking at the moment to agree those tables that Mark's just worked his way through on, table 2, table 3, around those centrally held budgets. Do we agree on the local authorities proposal? Anyone wanting to dissent on any of that? Okay, we'll move on, and then the next proposal that we're considering is to support the Central School Services block transfer of 495,000 to the schools block. Anyone wishing to dissent or disagree with that approach? Okay. 2 out of 3, Mark, we're doing well. And then moving on to the next one, which is to support the approaches to address the affordability through the schools growth funding, and the ARPU being reduced by 0.075% below the government's national fund and formula values for 23-24. Does anybody object or dissent against that proposal? Now, I think on my reckoning, Mark, that's covered off all the ones that you were looking for. Is that okay? Great.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We will then move on to agenda item 6, which is the early years national funding formula. That's on pages 35 to 50 of your pack. We're going to be asked to note the contents of this report, but also agree to the local authorities proposal for some centrally retained funding. So we'll invite Geraldine O'Neill, Sustainability and Development Manager, to kind of walk us through this one. So over to you, Geraldine.
Thank you, Gavin. Good afternoon, everyone. So the purpose of the early years report is to provide members with an overview of the national funding formula for 2023-24, to provide detail around the funding distribution for providers in Lincolnshire, and then to seek agreement for the local authority's centrally retained budget. The spending review provided an additional 180 million nationally to support an increase to the hourly rate paid to childcare providers in the next financial year. And then a further 20 million was announced in response to the national living wage increasing from April. The DfE published the final budgets on the 16th of December, which was much later than planned. All associated technical notes and operational guidance have been reviewed and will be used to implement the funding changes for this next financial year. The local authority's rate for 3 and 4-year-old funding will be £4.87 per hour, which is a 23p increase on the current rate of £4.64. This rate includes the teachers' pay and pension grant, which was previously allocated to local authorities through a separate grant allocation. Lincolnshire does continue to be funded on the lowest funding rate. Our hourly rate is actually £4.90 without protections or caps applied. However, this has been reduced by 3p per hour due to the government's enforcement of a ceiling cap of 4.9%. This is disappointing for Lincolnshire, and we've had the opportunity to raise some of our concerns directly with the Early Years Funding Division at the Department for Education. On page 36, you can see the 6 relevant funding streams that relate to early years, and those are the ones that the department provides to form the early years block of the DSG. Lincolnshire is one of 35 local authorities that are still funded on the minimum funding rate for 3 and 4 year olds. The national average rate across local authorities is £5.31. The area cost adjustment has a significant impact on their hourly rate for local authorities, and unfortunately Lincolnshire is classified as low. At the top of page 37, you can see the total indicative budget for Lincolnshire for 3 and 4 year olds, and that's using January 2022 census data. As previously mentioned, the Teachers' Pay and Pension Grant is included within the formula, and that represents 3p per hour. As always, final funding allocations for 23-24 will be based on 5/12 of the January 2023 census pupil numbers, and then 7/12 of the January 2024 pupil numbers, which are yet to come. We will continue to receive supplementary funding for maintained nursery schools. Nationally, an additional 10 million is being invested into M&S supplementary funding from 2023-24, and this has been used to uplift the lowest funded areas and create a fairer distribution of funding across all local authorities with maintained nursery schools. This is a positive outcome for Lincolnshire's 5 maintained nursery schools and a change from the previously cash flat funding that we've received. We will be working with those schools to agree the distribution of that supplementary funding for this coming year. Other key requirements within the national funding formula is detailed at the top of page 38. There's been an increase from 10% to 12% of the total value of funding for 3 and 4 year olds to go through the supplements, for example, and that takes account of the TPPG being included in the formula. On page 39, we've provided a summary of the background information that supports the theory within the early years formula. The national living wage will increase by 9.7%, and our financial model budgets for the £10.42 per hour increase that we'll be seeing for staffing costs. Non-staff costs have also been increased proportionally within the formula. And so the hourly base rate for providers it has been determined as £4.42 per hour. That's an increase of 22p per hour per child in the next financial year. The remaining 1p of the funding increase that we will see will support an uplift to the inclusion fund, an increase in deprivation supplementary payments, and a small increase in our central costs. The deprivation supplement have been proportionately increased, and we will allocate 873,000 through the formula in 2023-24. We have had increasing demands on inclusion funding for 3 and 4 year olds, and so we plan to increase the budget by 48,000 in the next financial year to support those pressures on that budget, and then we'll complete a review of this for the following financial year. We are really aware of the current economic circumstances facing the sector, and we want to maximise the rate for providers from the government funding settlement. We have had restrictions on the funding for Lincolnshire with the 3p reduction due to the ceiling cap. So to support as much as possible an increase on the base rate that providers will feel, we're proposing for the contingency fund to be met from anticipated underspend in the current financial year for 23-24. The government requires Schools Forum to agree our central spend for the early years by the 28th of February. So this is proposed as 1.627 million in 2023-24. That's an increase of 66,000, and that's really to reflect the current and forecast pay for the early years and childcare support team. That includes the pay award that's been seen this year and maintenance of that, and then the maintenance costs for the systems that we use to provide monthly payments to the childcare sector. We have made some savings within Central's costs through a reduction in travel and training now that we're moving to do more things online and using platforms in that way. So for the local authority to fulfil our statutory duties, the early years and childcare support team provide a range of services across the sector. The detail of each of those areas across the service is provided on page 42 through to page 44 within the report for you. That includes 3 elements: the early years entitlement and sufficiency and sustainability. That area is £522,461. That area is really to ensure all childcare providers in Lincolnshire receive timely and accurate payments for the delivery of the early years entitlement funding. The team manages the systems and processes and supports providers with advice and guidance to deliver those funding streams effectively. Alongside that, there is a growing concern across the childcare sector with regard to sustainability, particularly with the cost of living crisis and increasing staffing costs across the country. So there's an ongoing demand on the service for some financial support and business sustainability support. And to secure our sufficiency duty, we think that there'll be high demand on that service area going into 23-24. The second area there is the EYFS Quality Improvement Advice Support and Workforce and Training for the sector. And you'll see that that's over £1 million for that service area. The local authority is responsible overall for the outcomes of Ofsted inspections and the programme of support to support the judgments that are made against providers. A programme of supports in place to give new providers the best chance of achieving a good or better Ofsted judgment at their inspection, and also for maintaining support and quality across the childcare sector. Support's also offered to ensure providers can maintain compliance with EYFS safeguarding, welfare requirements, and enable children to have that maximum opportunity to develop and learn. And then the third area is for SEND support and the local offer. So the government requires all local authorities to establish an SEN inclusion fund. And as part of Lincolnshire's SEND local offer and the inclusion funding and coordinating that alongside the work within the Education, Health and Care Plan assessment process, we continue to coordinate and have oversight of that within the service area as well. And you can see that's represented there as 83,346 within the budget. All of those activities represent 4.39% of the overall planned spending for the early years funding in the next financial year, and that's below the government's threshold of 5% overall. At the bottom of page 44 and into the top of page 45, you can see a table detailing the breakdown of all elements within the 3 and 4 year old funding, and then that translates that into an equivalent hourly rate for you as well. This provides pass-through funding of 95.61% to providers in 23-24, and you can see the comparison there to the current year. The value of all supplements is 5.08%, which is below the 12% threshold that the government sets. And alongside the 3 and 4 year old central costs, there's also a number of other funding streams. So there's the disability access funding. That's set to increase by £28 from £800, which it is currently, to £828 per child per year. The early years pupil premium funding will increase by 2p from 60p per hour to 62p per hour. And the equivalent of that for a childcare provider across the year would be £353.40 per child. The 2 year old funding has increased by 6p to £5.63 per hour per child from central government. To ensure Lincolnshire receives a 1% year to year increase, 5p per hour of this relates to protection funding. We continue to have a lower number of 2 year olds in places in January each year, which is obviously the point at which the census is taken, and that's used to collect pupil numbers to inform our funding. So we do need to retain a larger contingency fund for the 2 year olds before determining the funding rate for providers to avoid any overspend on that budget. So we've allowed for £249,000 to be included within the budget for that, which represents 5.09%. A contribution towards central costs has been identified to support the 2 year old funding requirements, and £49,000 has been added to that, which represents 0.99% of the overall budget for 2 year olds. Including all of these arrangements, we've been able to increase the hourly rate to providers by 6p. So this will increase from £5.23 to £5.29 from April. And just to summarise, in Lincolnshire, we do recognise that the financial demands on the early years sector and we've applied as much of the government funding settlement to support that as we possibly can. The DfE have recognised the financial challenges being faced by the early years sector, and they've confirmed to us that they will continue to make representations to policyholders for 2024-25 funding levels to reflect those pressures and the need. So we'd like to seek Schools Forum agreement for the local authorities' proposals relating to the allocation and distribution of the centrally attained budgets within this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Can I invite any questions, please, for Geraldine on this paper? Being responsible for 3 nurseries, I'm very pleased to see that the 3 to 4 year old rate has gone up. I just still worry about my 2-year-olds, but I think we all know that. So we'll continue to that. Is there anybody else that wants to come back on anything that they've heard there?
Yes, please.
Professor Durans, over to you.
I'd just like to ask, Chairman, I presume that take-up of the early years support is not a mandatory thing, and I just wondered how many of our parents take it up, or whether there's a lot of people who don't do. Thank you.
Yes, in terms of the 2-year-old entitlement, at the end of the autumn term, we had 84% of children that were eligible to take up their entitlement accessing those places, which is above the national average levels, and we're really pleased about that. That does fluctuate across the year, but what we are seeing is the number of children that are eligible, because it's based on economic circumstances, that's actually decreasing, not just in Lincolnshire but nationally. We're actually seeing a trajectory on the families that are eligible for 30 hours to receive the 30 hours for their 3 and 4 year olds, and that's very much based on working families. So there's a slight shift in terms of those eligible, but participation levels continue to be high. It's not mandatory, no, but the 3 and 4 year olds accessing their entitlement continues to be above 90%. So really quite high take up in terms of the early years funded places.
That's most encouraging, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Geraldine. Julia, please.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I'm struggling with technology at the moment. I'd like to thank Geraldine and the team for all the work they've done. And as everyone else is probably aware, any increase is appreciated, but a 1% and a 5% increase when wages are going up 9.7 on the national minimum wage, and my electricity bill's just gone up 54%. In an area of deprivation where I'm predominantly funded children, I can't charge extras, the parents haven't got it, and I can't raise my fees because I haven't got children who are paying fees. Does the government realise this is going to end in disaster, especially along the eastern coast?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. What we are doing is making those representations really, really clear to the Department for Education, and they are continuing to talk to us about that. And I am on the working group, the funding working group, and the early years policy team are listening to what we're telling them with regard to that, and they are making those representations up to Treasury for decision making in the future. They're listening. And we will continue to do that on your behalf.
Thank you
very much. Anybody else? I can't see anybody else in the chat. So we'll take the same approach. Oh, Amy, sorry, you got your hand up.
Stenser.
Yeah, over to you, Amy.
Hi, Geraldine. Thank you very much for your report. Similar to Julia, really, we're a nursery school facing additional on costs for staff in all kinds of costs this year. We wondered if it was made available the information about inclusion and special needs issues and financial on costs for that. We're doing a costing exercise at the moment at the necessary additional costs that our are incurring on our budget, and actually it's costing us over £8,500 a year per child before we get to the complex needs stage, and that's having a real detrimental impact on our budget, and it didn't seem to make clear in the report what the implications were for Lincolnshire in terms of inclusion support. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, we have considered that, and we are going to look at that quite closely this year. What we want to do, we've obviously made provisions for the current pressures that we're seeing on the demand for the Inclusion Fund budget. We're mindful of the additional costs that you have to deliver those places as well. So we're going to be doing a detailed consultation exercise this year to understand what the additional costs are, and then look at how we're distributing any elements of the Inclusion Fund. Obviously, that's a supplementary element of the overall 3 and 4 year old budget. So any additional pressures that are put on that also have a knock-on effect on the base rate funding that we can provide to you all as well. So yeah, we need to carefully consider that. We want to do some consultation, and we're going to come out to all providers with that in the coming months, and then look to do a review for next financial year so that that works for everybody.
Okay, great. Anything further for Geraldine? Okay, so we have got some voting to do on this. So again, I think we'll take the same approach, which will be by dissent. So we're asking everybody if they agree with the local authority's proposal for the centrally retained funding linked to early years. If anybody wishes to dissent or disagree with that, can you indicate that in the chat for me, please? And if we don't see anything from anybody, then we'll take that everybody agrees. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time, Geraldine, and for the paper. And we'll move on to our next item, which is item number 7, which is the sector-led approach on pages 51 to 56 of your pack. And we'll move over to a different Geraldine this time. So Geraldine Wilders, Head of Service for School Strategy. We're just asked to note the content of this report and is a general update for us. So Geraldine, over to you.
Thank you, Gavin, and good afternoon, everyone. So this report is presented to Schools Forum to outline performance data from 2022 and Ofsted inspection outcomes compared with national averages. Goes on to give an update on Lincolnshire Learning Partnership and the Teaching School Hub, and Schools Forum members are asked to note the contents of the report. In relation to Ofsted, as previously reported, Ofsted suspended routine inspections of schools due to the pandemic. Routine inspections recommenced in September 2021. This included the inspection of outstanding schools, which had previously been exempt from routine inspection. And as of 30th of November 2022, 70.4% of secondary schools and 83.9% of primary schools are judged to be good or better. The proportion of Lincolnshire schools judged as good or better was 82.7%. This is below the statistical neighbours and the national average. Moving on to statutory assessments. As expected, there was an impact on the outcome of pupils in statutory testing due to the pandemic. As different areas of the country will have been impacted differently by the pandemic, direct comparison between 2019 and 2022 should be avoided, and rather compare Lincolnshire's gap to national between the years is recommended instead. Outcomes dropped nationally, and in most areas, Lincolnshire closed the gap marginally on national. At the end of the Early Years Foundation study, the proportion of pupils achieving a good level of development in Lincolnshire was 64.1%. Lincolnshire closed the gap by 1.1% against national. For those who achieved the expected level across all early learning goals, the gap closed by 1.3%. In phonics, the assessment assessed at the end of year 1, the proportion of pupils meeting the expected standard was 74% compared to a national figure of 75%. And this is in line with statistical neighbours and just below national by 1%. The gap remains the same. The gap between Lincolnshire and national at Key Stage 1 remains broadly the same, though widened in writing. At the end of Key Stage 2, the proportion of pupils achieving the expected standard in reading, writing and maths combined was 55% compared with the national average of 59.9%. The gap between Lincolnshire and national has remained broadly the same compared to 2019, though the gap did close on national in reading and maths marginally. At Key Stage 4, Lincolnshire performance was broadly in line with national. Average attainment 8 score was 48.5 in 2022, and the average progress 8 score in Lincolnshire is -0.02. There remains a wide spread of performance across schools and districts in the county. Deprivation continues to be a key indicator in terms of performance. Lincoln and Boston have some of the highest levels of deprivation affecting children, whilst North Kesteven some of the least. Moving on to the strategy for school improvement, the strategy endeavours to ensure that all maintained schools receive at least one termly visit from their educational locality lead. Visits are planned to support, monitor and challenge leaders at all levels, including governors, and to support schools to engage with and benefit from a range of programmes and, where relevant, intervention in a timely way to support schools to be in a strong position moving forward. The core element of this work, although far-reaching, but the core element of the work of educational locality leads is to support leaders to ensure they have a curriculum that is ambitious and designed to give all pupils the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. Termly agendas are designed to support leaders in their evaluation against the Ofsted framework. Lincolnshire Learning Partnership Board acts as our governance of the system, and since being established, it has been instrumental in driving policy change in Lincolnshire and ensuring that head teachers have a collective voice. Catherine Stratton, as current chair of the board, has endeavoured to develop the way the board functions and refreshing its work for the next stage of our sector-led system in Lincolnshire. Due to the pandemic, the allocation of the earmarked dedicated school grant underspends was delayed, but at the most recent board meeting in November, it was agreed to allocate these funds to implement projects with particular focus on leadership development, SEND and a locality-based project, and these are in the planning stages currently. Lincolnshire Learning Partnership Board, supported by the local authority, provides regular leadership briefings for school leaders, which continue to be well attended by leaders in both maintained schools and academies, and this is greatly appreciated. The board continues to work alongside the local authority education team, the Lead Teaching School Hub and the CEO network. With the Teaching School Hub, our Teaching School Hub continues to work strategically in partnership with the local authority and Lincolnshire Learning Partnership Board to ensure we have a joined up working and to respond to the needs of the sector. The Teaching School Hub is the central place for schools to access other curriculum hubs and nationally designated specialist centres. The local authority, Lincolnshire Learning Partnership Board and the Teaching School Hub are actively working together to ensure that we build on the strengths of the current system moving forward against a strategic plan which aims to collectively raise outcomes for pupils through the development of the education workforce across Lincolnshire. In conclusion, the service that the local authority provides in partnership with LLPB and the Teaching School Hub remains an essential and effective partnership in the landscape of education and school improvement. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Do we have anybody with any questions for Geraldine on that update? As we mentioned, we're just there to note the contents of the report. If you've got anything, just pop it in the chat or put your hand up. Doesn't look like anything, Geraldine, so thank you very much. We'll note the contents and we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is the standard one that we receive, agenda item 8, which is the Academies and Trusts update on page 57 to 60 of your pack. I think Mark Popper is just going to give us the update on any changes with regard to academisation.
Okay, thanks, Chair. So in terms of the Academies and Trusts update, this is at the position at the 1st of January 2023. Since the effective date of the last report, so that presented in the October Schools Forum based on the September 2022 position, only one school, Old Leek Primary and Nursery, has joined an Academy Trust on the 1st of November. What that actually means in terms of the overall position in terms of Lincolnshire's position relating to maintained and academy schools. So what we're seeing in terms of pupil numbers, so 72.5% of Lincolnshire pupils attend an academy. But then the split is slightly different in terms of the number of schools. So 52% of schools in Lincolnshire are academies versus the 48% in maintained. And currently there is no school formally seeking or being required to become an academy in terms of the forecast 6-month projection. Moving on to the next page, a table there summarises the latest number or the largest number of Lincolnshire schools in a multi-academy trust. That's on page 59, so there's no real significant change relating to that position. So yeah, essentially the Schools Forum is asked to note the contents of the report. So minimal changes.
Great. Any questions on that one? I think it's normally fairly straightforward and self-explanatory. Can't see anything in the chat at that point, so we'll move along to item number 9, which is the Lincolnshire Schools Forum work programme. Again, this is shared with us every time, just so that we can anticipate what's coming up. You'll note from that that our next meeting is the 20th of April. And we've got papers there on building communities and specialist provision. So an update again for us on the work that's going on around special schools, and currently the Academy Trust update, but I'm sure there'll be some additional papers added to that in due course. So it remains for me to kind of thank you for your participation and attendance this afternoon at the Schools Forum meeting. I hope you have a great rest of the term. And that concludes our business for today. Thank you very much, and speak to you all very soon. Thank you.